Thank you, Petrina. That was excellent. Now we move swiftly on to our final session of the day, EdTech. EdTech. We've got a great panel lined up. In no particular order, I'd like to welcome back to the stage Brad Barbera, this time wearing a Zia Learning hat. Anthony Chan, Chief Executive of Isola Capital, and Raj Shastri, Partner at Kaizen Private Equity. Welcome, gentlemen. So we got a lot of time, but I still think we're going to run out. As is customary, I'd like everyone just to take a minute just to introduce themselves, their company, and please start, Raj.
Yes, I'm Raj from Kaizen Private Equity. We are a private equity fund, and we focus on education sector in South Asia and Southeast Asia. We have invested in various segments of education, starting from preschool to high school, secondary schools, test preparation companies, vocational training, education financing companies, and we have done both good and bad. We also done EdTech, so looking forward to share some of the experiences.
Yeah, I'm from Isola Capital. We're a family office-backed asset management platform. In private equity, one of the sectors we focus on is education, and very similar to Raj, we've invested in offline K-12 businesses, and then on the venture side, we've invested in various EdTech companies and also an EdTech fund as an anchor LP. So education is one of the core sectors that we focus on.
And I have worked as a innovation and strategy consultant, and one of my clients was is a EdTech organization developing both the curricula as well as training platforms for teachers and students.
Fantastic. I will be coming to the audience for questions. I may even pick one or two of you at random, so just to keep you on your toes, make sure that you earn the drinks at the end of today. Gentlemen, education models, they've been the same for centuries and centuries, forever, really. I mean, what trends are we seeing now that are causing the education sector to be ripe for disruption? Anthony?
Yeah, I think one of the things we've noticed, especially over the last 5-6 years, is that there's an increasing trend to hybrid learning platforms. So traditionally, education is a high-touch business, especially at younger age groups. You require, high quality, face-to-face teaching. But because the quality of teaching staff is not easy to find and to maintain consistency, and also sometimes for certain subjects like English, you need native English speakers. So technology has been brought on, to facilitate, right, to ensure there's that consistent capability to deliver certain outcomes. And then obviously, private education is expensive, so parents pay for education, and they want ways to benchmark and measure outcomes. So there's a lot of technology that's been developed to assess students, to see whether or not, the education that the parents are paying for is actually generating the outcome. So those are some things that we see.
Consistency then for you is the key trend. Raj, what are you picking up?
Yeah, so I think the first point which you said was, it's about the availability of the teachers, anywhere in the world, who can actually teach online to a kid in province in China, in India, in Vietnam, right? So that's one of the value add. The other thing is, I just got, an email from the school for my, son's report card, and I just opened it. There's so many graphs and charts, right? And I said, my God, this is just a data interpretation job for me right now. So, and that's exactly what he was just alluding to, which is, there's so much data you can capture on a child's learning, right? And present it to the two stakeholders. One is the teacher and the other is the parent, right? So we are aware of what's going on and what's the learning need for the student, right? So we have to measure, and then we have to present, and we have to take an action, right? Based on this, we can really improve. And, there are a lot of, examples which we can, come to right now. So that's, for me, is one of the major trends.
So your trend would be just there's far more data out there now accessible for us to use.
Yes. Yeah. I think using data to predict, what the student should learn and what are the areas he should focus on.
Okay. But I mean, it's all getting a bit too much of the machine. I mean, Brad, do you think there needs to be a bit more of a human touch? Is there something missing here?
Yes, I think that is probably the trend that Zia Learning was seeing, is that the technology itself has tremendous promise, but it left behind the human element for both the student and the teacher. There were many people thought that kids these days, they're all tech savvy, they know how to use their phones all the time, they're always on their phones, and there's just a ton of videos and educational systems and things online, so we'll just transition to that and everything's going to be great. And what they found was a lot of the social emotional skills aren't there for the kids. They don't know how to manage their time. They don't know how to put things together in unique and interesting ways. The teachers have no idea how to implement some of these technologies because they have come up in the system where they're just talking heads at the front of a room telling the students, and they have to have subject matter expertise. Well, now you don't need subject matter expertise. So what's the purpose of the teachers? And the teachers feel threatened. It's just that all those human emotional elements were kind of left behind when tech education first started making its appearance. And I think now the trend is people are trying to figure out how to incorporate those human elements into the new system.
So don't you think it's happening the other way? I mean, just a question, because the teachers, they don't want technology sometimes, and technology is trying to replace teachers. So how this fight is, getting solved, in your opinion?
That's where, at least with Zia Learning, and so all of my perspective is going to come from them, they were really focused on change management as a critical part of their whole technology introduction. So they were doing professional education for the teachers on how their role changes. So they don't have to be the subject matter experts, but they do have to be the experts at helping the students learn how to use the technology and personalizing that experience for the individual students because they're all over in terms of their abilities to handle these technologies.
Instead of imparting knowledge is basically teaching them how to learn.
Exactly.
I think also you can't have tech for tech's sake, I think, when you said earlier. Any questions so far? I am on maneuvers. Mark. I'll go to him.
Yeah, I mean, just one of the things on a more kind of Asia Pacific level would be, are you seeing anything in terms of tech being used to improve the quality of teachers in kind of developing markets where you've got, maybe the subject matter skills that they've been taught isn't, the teachers themselves aren't so au fait with the subject matter, so then they're imparting kind of a poor learning experience to the students, and it perpetuates a bad outcome. Have you seen anything in that space where trying to leverage tech of, quality teachers on this side kind of teaching the teachers, if you know what I mean, or trying to, educate our departments of education in developing countries?
Yes, it is happening. So I'll take an example of Vietnam, the company which is, in process of, evaluating them, right? So they actually follow American curriculum. And I was just reading the report, and they said that this year they did two things. One is they introduced some of this, tech platform in the classroom, right? An assessment platform called IXL, which I just told you, right? And so this platform, what it does is, you go home and then you do the homework, and then it tells you that where exactly the problem is. So it'll give you a bell curve by saying that, 90% of the students or 70% of the students has problem in this concept, right? So now through that, what's the problem, so you can solve it. The principal knows that, the school is not getting taught on this particular, so it will be used to evaluate the teacher, right? The parents might also come to know that these are the areas we can focus on, right? And there are several other tools, and based on that, you can also train the teacher, what he was talking about, that, your role is changing. It's not about, just giving them the information which they can find on their mobile. right? It's about how you draw conclusion from that, whether you're learning, what you're learning from it, right? So I've seen that happening in, underdeveloped countries or developing countries. Yeah.
Maybe I could just add two examples. One, which is one of our portfolio companies in Korea. So Korea, if you're familiar, it's a bit like Japan. It's 80% export GDP, but people there are very shy to speak English, and they actually generally educated in English throughout the whole K to 12, but they can't really communicate. So the business we invested into, we partnered with Scholastic in the US. So as a publisher, they developed the content to teach authentic English. But the problem was they couldn't find enough teachers who could actually speak proper English, American English. And so they introduced what they called the digital whiteboard. And so 4 years ago, they were going at about $4,000 each. Now it's about $2,500. So what happens is you can get a native Korean teacher who understands English to teach a curriculum. But when it comes to the phonics and the speaking and the language, they actually press a button on the screen, and there's a digital, visualization of an American teacher speaking perfect American English. And the kids can go online at home to then go and watch, video loops and hear that. The other thing is they've also introduced an app. So a lot of the Korean parents are not so familiar with, whether an English program is actually working. This app measures the Lexile reading level of the child. So it's not perfect, but it will check what type of fiction, non-fiction materials the child is reading over the past week, past month, and it will measure the level of Lexile, of the materials that they're reading over time. So you should see measurable improvement that the kid is reading harder and harder materials. So there are technologies like that that enable people in certain countries to actually adapt to maybe a foreign curriculum to learn a native English language like that. The other example, I think we talked as a group before this, there's actually a Hong Kong company, and I'm not here to advertise, so I won't say the name. But
Please do.
Can I say that?
Yeah, might as well.
Snap Ask, right? So there's this brilliant young guy who came up with this program. I think, Raj, you looked at it a year ago. He's come up with an app that allows lower socioeconomic income families to allow their kids to get access to tutoring services. So, in Asia, a lot of the developed markets, the wealthier families send their kids to after-school academies or private tutoring at home. But if you come from a lower economic social class, you may not have access. So what he's developed is for about $80 US a month, which is affordable. You have 24/7 access to. I think Hong Kong has about 30,000 tutors online. I think similar number in Taiwan, maybe less in Korea. But he's rolled out in 10 or 12 markets, where let's say 2 a.m. in the morning, you're a middle school student, you're struggling with your algebra or calculus. You can just scan, take a picture of a question, send it out. There will be a queue of 50 teachers or tutors wanting to go help answer your question. And if the guy struggles to answer your question, you can just kick him out. It's like Uber. You pick another one. And it's actually, I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it levels the playing field a little bit. And it's about technology enabling students access to teachers and quality teachers, hopefully, which they otherwise couldn't access themselves in traditional format. So it's an interesting way how EdTech is developing.
Out of interest, how do they qualify the teachers themselves on that app?
Okay, so again, I'm not operating it, but I'll tell you what they tell us. There is a minimum requirement. They have to be university graduates, certain GPA level, certain subject matter expertise, and teachers are rated based on their performance. So it's a bit like Uber. So if this guy's teaching all the wrong results, over time their rating is so low that nobody's gonna use them. So that
You should give it up at that point.
yeah, probably.
Okay, excellent. Quick, next question really is, if I've had £1 for every time someone's told me EdTech is going to be the next fintech, I'd be moderately wealthy, or wealthier than I am now. What is the bug in the system? What's stopping the scalability of EdTech?
You haven't made any money in EdTech?
I'll start. The experience with Zia Learning in terms of scaling is we talked a lot about there were isolated pockets of success. So you'd have a teacher or maybe even one school that would be very successful implementing, and then you would try to go out to the rest of the district or the rest of the state or the rest of the country, and it would fail. And the place where the failure was occurring was always in that the ability of the teachers to adapt to a new way of teaching. So some teachers were very good at allowing the technology to be the content expert, and they were that human connection, and they figured out how to address a student's needs one-on-one. They figured out how to get groups of students to work together and learn together and have that human interaction experience. But so many other teachers were just resistant to changing. They had their way of doing it. They saw the technology as a threat, and then they would not implement it. So that's where the change management expertise was necessary to try to scale, where you would work with the teachers that were best at this first, get them to show some success. That would allow other teachers to say, hey, that's interesting that you're being successful with it. How can I learn from you? Then they would have success, and it would build from there. That seems to be a big part of it. And a lot of it had to do with setting the expectations of the parents and the government agencies, whoever they may be, the school districts, in terms of how is this going to be successful. So many thought that we just buy the platform, flip the on switch, and it'll just be successful. And when it wasn't, they would say, well, the platform stinks, we're going to get rid of it. And they never gave it that chance to really become something ingrained in how the organization worked.
I suppose the education sector needs educating on EdTech.
Absolutely right, yes.
I'm here all day, thank you. Anthony, do you have anything to add on
I think
scalability?
very similar to what Brad said, but maybe a little bit more controversial, but it's more in the Asian context, is I think EdTech will have more traction in the private education market. And private education market in Asia, I think, is more accepted because parents generally want to get their kids ahead. So I absolutely agree with Brad. A lot of the traditional public school education system, the incumbent teachers, they're not going to want to relearn how to teach their kids or readapt to new technologies and new assessment methodologies, because it might also expose their own lack of efficacy in terms of their ability to educate kids. So it really relies on the private sector, right? Whether it's private schools, international schools, or after-school enrichment programs, where parents who have the understanding, who are well-informed, who have the capital capacity, will actually be willing to spend money to give their kids that opportunity to leverage new ways of learning and EdTech. So unfortunately, education is a very elitist business. But for-profit education, I think in niches, it is scalable and it can make a lot of money. And I'll just use one small example of a business we invested into, which is in coding. So everybody's talking about STEM, STEAM, STREAM, whatever it is. It's over the last 10 years, but I think more and more so people are focused on the fact that we're moving into 21st century learning and education. So it's important for kids to have good computational skills, good logic. And so the coding program that we invested into can be applied into any country irrespective of the language, right? The spoken language, because it's actually about computational logic, and you're learning through graphics first and then later on using Python language. So that is a type of EdTech that is very scalable because there's application irrespective of language, culture, regulatory environment. So,
Raj?
So I completely agree with both of them that the whole thing about education is it should be given by the government, and the teachers control a lot of things, right? So that's one of the reasons why it didn't flourish, or technology didn't get into education the way it should have been. The other aspect, I think, is also consumer behavior.
Okay.
It's a high-stake game. You know what I mean? Is what do I lose by ordering food through Food Panda or from Uber Eats?
Cold pizza, wow.
Yeah, a cold pizza. Yeah, that's pretty much right. Or even I go to a restaurant, bad restaurant, $100, right? Now, if I put my kid to a school which I really don't like, that's a drain of like $20,000 or something. At least in Singapore. Right?
Yeah.
So, and Hong Kong as well, right? So it's a high-stake game. So before we put money in education, we have to be absolutely sure that it's going to work, right? And some of these tech-enabled schools, new age schools, we haven't seen the progress yet. in terms of student outcome, right? And these outcomes are also decided by going to a university in the US, right? Now, that's also kind of questionable, right?
Yeah.
So I think this whole thing of, what I want, which is, kind of set by the society, and in order to get there, I have a proven path, which I have taken, and I don't want to deviate from that. So I think it will take some time to change, but so it won't be like a fintech, which is very transaction-based.
Yeah. I mean, the education sector is very conservative. Some parts in Asia are very conservative, and I don't know so much about Singapore, but Hong Kong, you have the tiger mom, who is gonna, if she's gonna throw down how much money on an app, it damn better work, and if it doesn't work, then it's game over for them, really. Any questions at this point?
Thank you. Hi guys. Personally, I invest into the EdTech sector myself, and I research for it, and I try to find some new ways of getting into this market. I have some questions for you, like during the discussion. For example, what do you think about the personalized education's method? Like, we all know that the biggest problem in education, that it's one system and like 30 people in the classroom, and like they're all completely different. Like one is a challenger, one likes to sit on his and do nothing, like, and they won't accept just one system. So basically, I think that we're gonna find some companies that can make some personalized educational programs based on the characters they want to teach. Like, and what you think about this technology?
Maybe I'll take part of this. So if you look at currently what's in the broader market, Montessori, for example, I don't know if you're familiar, younger age group Montessori, they mix kids from 3 to 6, and then they go from 6 to 9 or whatever it is, because of exactly the problem that you mentioned. Kids, when you're 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, 6 months can be a huge development physically, mentally, psychologically. So in the younger age group, Montessori tries to cater for that. And obviously, I'm not suggesting their learning system is the best, but at least from a psychological and social learning perspective, it nurtures kids, it allows the older kids to look after the younger kids, it allows kids who are progressing faster to step up and do more things, it makes them more independent. So I think that there are certain learning systems that already allow for them. But in terms of personalization, the biggest problem is actually education is mandated by the government, right? It's usually regulated. There's curriculum, right? And if you want to progress through, kindergarten, elementary school, middle school, high school, and get into tertiary education, you have to sit for exams, right? Certainly when you go from high school to university. So if you don't stick with the, mandated curriculum and you try to do too much personalization, then you may not actually get into the university that you want to get into. So if you're doing it as a supplemental to personalize for yourself, to adapt for your skill set, great. But ultimately, the student has to, fit into the broader system. So until the government deregulates education and says, look, you don't need to follow curriculum, you just have to sit one exam at the end of high school, then I think it's going to be really tough for kids going all the way through to high school to have very personalized education. Personalized education, I think, works when you're in adult education or vocational education. So sometimes when we talk about EdTech, I think we always seem to focus on kids. But in fact, a lot of EdTech, the application is actually for adults, people post-high school or who decide not to pursue.
More aware people.
Well, yes, if you can put it that way, yes.
Yeah. Okay. I have a comment on that. Just like yes, we have the system that's controlled like completely by the government, and there is nothing can be changed in it. We all understand it. But I personally know that this sector, educational assistance, it has the biggest capital annual growth percent in the world at the moment. It's like over 50% annual growth in this sector. And why it's happening? Just I think it's because people got aware of the problem that they won't get the needed education from the schools and from the universities. Like they got aware that like in 12 or 30 years the AI is gonna crash, it's gonna crash on us, and the half of people will lose their jobs actually. And well, I can ask myself like, if the education I'm getting now at the university will help me to survive in the world of the future technologies. Like, no, it won't. Yeah. Like actually, so what am I gonna do? I'm gonna go online and search for the supplemental education, just like you've mentioned. So I believe that this awareness that raises in the people's minds, make them go and look for additional education and additional skills. That is the main driver, I think, for the educational sector growth and these abnormal percentages. I actually believe that the educational sector is going to be like the biggest one in 10 years, only because this awareness shiftness. Yeah. So that's my comment on it. What you think?
So I think, you know, what you said is absolutely correct. And if you see some of this progressive curriculum which you're talking about, for example, IB, you know, International Baccalaureate, they don't talk about, you know, testing in the normal way. They talk about, you know, education outdoor, right? So there, you know, the testing, the methods of testing are different, you know, compared to the traditional testing which we see, you know, done by the government, or, you know, which has been there for several years, right? That's one. And I think in terms of personalized learning for a student, a kid in the class, that can be solved by technology. It is getting solved gradually, right? Which is every kid learns in a different way, or at least, you know, out of 20 kids, there will be 5 kids learning in a different way compared to the rest of the kids, right? Now, that can be solved by more self-learning platforms and capturing the data of how these kids are learning and then pushing them the content accordingly, right? So even if the curriculum doesn't allow you, but through pedagogy, you can do that.
Okay. Oh, thank you. I'd like also to mention one company. It's called Rosetta Stone. Have you heard about it? Yes. Rosetta Stone. Rosetta Stone. Yeah, like it's a company has like 250 million revenue and like wholly owned by one founders. They haven't attracted any single dollar from investors. And I started digging like how did they manage to get these high revenues? It's all about the new type of education of languages. The company basically sells the language courses actually. So I started digging and I found out that their technology of the teaching the language, it's completely different from everything that we know on the market. So they're giving courses that do not translate the language you are trying to teach into your own language. So basically it's like they give you a translation of 10 words in the first place, and then you get explained all the other words by those 10 words that you got on the first place. And it drags your brain into the thinking pattern on this language you're trying to teach, and it's like boosting like 300% more effective than the usual way. I gave an example of the education technology of the future. Like it's completely different from all these, I don't know how it's called, dogma mongering systems that we have at the moment. Can you give a comment on this company or something like this?
I won't talk about Rosetta Stone. I know what that business is, but maybe I use a slightly different analogy, right, for education. So we all look at Tesla and we look at electric cars now. And how a lot of the bigger OEM manufacturers are going to launch full electric in a few years' time. That technology has been around for a long time. And part of the inertia is because there was so much money invested by the big manufacturers into internal combustion engines, right? So you know, the development cycle is so long, you put so much capex in, you've got a lot of vested interest from the big oil majors. The whole ecosystem won't allow you to go direct to electric 10 years ago, even though the same technology was there. The battery technology was not there, but the power system was there. So education's the same, right? There's going to be a lot of inertia because you've got these gigantic, you know, bureaucracies and infrastructure where, you know, education employs a lot of people, right, in the public sector. So I agree with you. You know, if you ask, you know, a lot of people in EdTech, they'll tell you, what's the point of kids learning calculus and algebra in school? What's your application in real life? You know, when I went to school, I had to learn the Dewey Decimal System, whatever, to look for books in the library. Nowadays, if a kid wants to find something, they just Google. They use Siri, right? Siri, volcano, and then, you know, all the stuff comes out. So a lot of the traditional learning and rote learning and the memory and the application doesn't make any sense, right? So totally agree with you that probably a lot of what we consider to be the education process now is probably irrelevant already. But it's going to take a lot to wipe out that system because so many different people have vested interests and livelihood tied up in the current system. But yes, maybe in a decade or two, people will basically be challenging why bother going through the traditional school system? Do I really need to get to Ivy League school? Do I really need to go to Oxbridge? Maybe it will be driven by the employers. The employers say, I just want kids who understand computational thinking, right? People who are good at math, science, engineering, all the key sort of subject matters that are relevant in the future. Maybe that's what it is. But I think right now the ecosystem of traditional education is so dominant. You're not going to see that big shift anytime soon.
And actually, I think it's a little counterintuitive, but where we are seeing the changes actually starting to take place are at the less wealthy school districts. The wealthier school districts already have the best teachers. They already have all the resources they need to teach the kids really well. These poorer school districts are investing more. They're more willing to change because they don't have all sorts of alternatives. And so they are adapting these technologies a lot faster, putting a lot more energy into them. And I think they're starting to see that it's paying off as well. So I think the revolution is, first of all, I think the revolution is inevitable, but it's actually going to start from an area that people wouldn't normally expect.
The change has been forced. They have to change. They have to adapt to survive and give their kids a good education.
They do, and they're less resistant to change because they know they don't have alternatives.
Yeah.
If a wealthy school district teacher doesn't want to do the education technology, they'll go to a different wealthy school district, and they'll be just fine. A poor school district, those teachers don't necessarily have the alternatives, and so they're more willing to give them a try.
The same thesis applies to Southeast Asia or Asia in general, because the government here doesn't have the money to spend on education, so it has to be private. And when it comes to private, they have to make it affordable for people, right? Because they want scale.
Yeah. We got one more question here. So, sounds dangerous.
I don't think we have a backstage.
Yeah, with drinks, with
maybe
drinks.
one question probably more for Anthony and Raj, since you guys are looking at EdTech. Is there anywhere, either in Asia or globally, that has become a hub for EdTech where it's got massive kind of government support backing to say, there's FinTech, there's EdTech, there's MedTech, but a government or an agency has rolled in behind and said, we're going to be a centre of excellence for EdTech development, whatever that may be, whether it's applications in our own.
Why do we need government? Sorry.
No, I'm saying to create a supportive ecosystem for these startups and companies to.
I come from.
Is it Singapore, Silicon Valley? Is it London?
Yeah, well, Singapore government is very different, but the countries where we invest, which are developing countries, I think there I definitely want government to stay out, right? The government will do a great job if they don't poke their nose in this sector, right? That's what I'm looking for.
Even supporting, from an ecosystem point of view in terms of startup capital, not getting involved in the
Investor friendly in a sense.
Investor friendly.
Well, I think you have to make this investor friendly in terms of tax benefit or making but both the gentlemen were saying that the main problem is because this has been run by the government and there are a lot of resistance to change. So I would like the opposite to happen, that open up the sector for private sector to come in and don't have this fallacy of this for profit, not for profit. Doesn't mean anything. Yeah, so that's my opinion.
No, just a quick comment. I think there's probably no need for any government institution to focus on EdTech. I think generally, especially in North Asia, most of the governments that recognize the need to promote venture, they're doing it anyway. So as long as you fulfill certain requirements, there'll be grants, there'll be matching funding. Cyberport, not fantastic, but they're starting to get the hang of it. Singapore's 10 years ahead, and obviously everybody's chasing. But I think if you look at China, for example, they're in all verticals of technology, right, where there's support. So EdTech is clearly one of them. And the valuations are showing that, right? So sometimes you almost wonder in China how much tech is in the EdTech business. I don't want to name names, but there are businesses where, you give access to U.S. College students to speak with kids. Yeah, but it's not tech. It's just using video conferencing technology, giving people access to people who speak native English, and suddenly you get a valuation that's, EdTech evaluation. So I think, look, there's going to be an ecosystem that's going to grow increasingly. across all subsegments of venture. But EdTech, I do believe, will be one of the winners. It's a sector that's easy to understand, easy to attract capital, and a lot of people see, the large population that potentially should leverage those education technologies. So I think it's definitely one of the biggest spaces.
Okay, excellent. So we are quickly running out of time. Slightly more of an abstract question, then. What is it about an EdTech company that you look for? So, I mean, EdTech is a huge space, right? It could be teaching kindergarten, it could be vocational. Is there a common theme throughout the companies that you've chosen? Or is there something that you look for in the DNA of the company? Or is there a reason why you work with Zia? I mean, what was special about them?
What is special about Zia, and again, I'm a broken record on this, but it's that human element. They are tying their technology to the human side of things. And if you look at forecasts about what the economy is going to look like in 10, 15, 20, 50 years, whatever, there's all the talk is about how AI is going to replace all these different jobs. The jobs where you will have success are where the human element is required. And so I think, my personal opinion, if you're going to invest in an EdTech company, it should be one that is trying to use the technology in a very human way, one that is focusing on helping kids learn to be productive adults and not just, computational machines.
Anthony?
Yeah, I think my comment is more generic across all venture companies we look at. I mean, there has to be an addressable problem or market, right? So I don't think we're interested in things that don't address an immediate problem or a foreseeable market. And then I think we believe, like everybody else, successful venture is always going to be a global application, right? So I think those are the attributes we look for. And then the key thing at the end of the day, it's the entrepreneur, the founders, the management team, right? So it's a bit more generic, nothing specific for EdTech.
Okay. I said you're looking for that global factor, but a lot of EdTech can't be global. It's
no, but I gave you an example like coding. That's
okay,
a global, right? And the technologies for assessing, Lexile reading level, that's global, right? Because it's the applications or testing English level. So there's always global application.
Yeah. I tried tripping him up, and he tripped me up. Raj.
So when we look at tech, like you said, I think, how much tech is there in tech? Sometimes it might be, very minimal, right? What we look at is, are you doing tech for the sake of tech, or are you really solving a problem, and what's the value proposition to the customer?
Okay.
Right? Yeah. That's very important. It's not, so we have looked at several companies, bringing teacher online, and I don't know why they want to solve the problem, because the problem doesn't exist, right? It's just for the, the thing of, I started with something, I want to do something in EdTech, and that's why I started, right? So I think the value proposition to the customer has to be clear so that the customer shifts from traditional to tech, right? So if I don't see that, then it's not interesting.
Yeah. Okay. We are 2.5 minutes left. We have a question in the corner.
Hello. 2 questions for the panel. So the first question is, if you had to pick between 2 similar type of business, since we're on the EdTech topic, one is old school, purely brand focused. One is the new tech, more technology driven. What would be a factor for you to pick one over the other? I heard, for example, Anthony say valuation. I heard Raj mention something customer base. So can you give one more example each, if possible? And the second question is, for these handheld translation devices, do you have a view, or is this your investment appetite? Thank you.
Yeah, they have these devices sent to the library. Yeah, maybe I try and tackle the first one. And I'm not trying to avoid your question, but I would say one of my earlier comments was that education is moving to hybrid education. So I don't see them being mutually exclusive. I don't think there's going to be a branded education business that won't adopt some sort of technology in their program, right? It's inevitable. It's more for efficacy, for assessment, for transparency, accountability, and just consistency of outcomes, right? So that's inevitable. How much they adopt and how quickly, I think that's a different issue. For a pure tech, same thing, right? Just you have a fantastic technology, but it doesn't fit into a business by itself, right? You would need a school, you need the human element, you would need a brand probably also, right, to attract, or some track record to attract the students. So I think EdTech is interesting in the sense that it will always be a sort of hybrid model. It will be the high touch model where you need, the interaction with the parents, right? The parents are the ones paying for the private education, right? Paying for the technology. So I don't know if that addresses your question, but I think there's definitely going to be both of those. In terms of the handheld device, we looked at a few things. There's actually a brand that if you travel in Cathay, there's a headset company that's from Germany that's selling one of their products on the airline catalog. We met with them. They have a technology that's built in where, when you speak, there's a live translation. Unfortunately, that's always going to be limited to certain, vocabulary and phrases and the ability for them to pick up, your accent. So if this guy, for example, was speaking, I don't know what sort of translation you're getting, but I'm being facetious. But I think that's never going to take away from the need for people to learn language properly, because a lot of nuances in language, it's all in how we interpret and how we, express ourselves, right? So the tone of your voice and all that sort of stuff. So I think those technologies are really meant to be for, stopgap situations where you need to suddenly have some translation, but you don't have a live interpreter, or you haven't learned the language properly. Maybe at some point it will get to the stage where it's advanced enough to do all the live, but at the moment, from a business perspective, I don't see that, substituting for a live interpreter if you need that.
Okay, good. We are out of time, but I'd just like to sum up your outlook for EdTech over the next 5-10 years. Good, bad, or so-so? Yeah. I know. Okay. Thank you very much, Raj, Anthony, and Brad.
Thanks for having me.
No worries.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you all for attending One-to-One Tech. It's been emotional over the last couple of days. Please stay for a couple of drinks. I'm sure you guys will stay. They love to be pestered. So, and again, thank you very much.